Hey everyone, welcome to the Orthodox Leader. My name is Ann Mitsakos Bezaridis, and the goal of this show is to give you, Orthodox Christian clergy and lay leaders, the knowledge, tools, and resources you need to be better stewards of your influence and have greater impact on the organizations you lead. I'm here today with Deacon Michael Hyatt. How you doing, Deacon Michael?
I'm doing great and much better than I was doing until about a week ago. Because I was, as you know, but our viewers don't know, I was out with COVID. So fully vaccinated, but I tested positive for COVID after an ordination I attended. And thankfully, nobody else got it but me. But the symptoms were pretty mild, but I had to be in quarantine for 10 days. So that kind of knocked me out of a bunch of stuff, including the last couple of weeks of us broadcasting this.
Wow. Well, you look great and you sound good.
Thank
So
you.
on the
Well,
mend.
yeah, I'm on the mint, definitely. I feel like 100% except for one thing. And that is actually two things. My smell and my taste are probably at about 30%. And the 30% just came back about 3 days ago because I literally, didn't have any taste or any smell at all. And that was weird. I was trying to share with my wife. I said, it's kind of like if you woke up in the morning and everything you saw visually was in black and white,
Wow.
So it was a little weird to be sure.
Yeah. Oh, well, I am thankful you were able to recover as fast as you did, and what solidarity you must now feel with so many people who've
Oh,
suffered through the virus.
yeah, I absolutely do. And I think, it was easy for me to cook because I couldn't taste. And and the other thing is that, whenever you go through suffering of any kind, mild as this was, and I certainly didn't have it bad like a lot of people I know, but it does give you empathy for people,
Yeah.
for
Wow.
sure.
Wow.
So
Well, thank God. We're glad you're back.
thank you. Glad to be
Yeah.
back.
Well, we are excited for tonight's show. And in it, we plan to conclude this wonderful three-part mini-series on the disciplines of self-leadership. In episode 2, we discussed the discipline of self-awareness. Then in episode 3, we discussed the discipline of self-control. By way of review, since it's been a few weeks, you defined self-control as the ability to think, speak, and act in a way that is congruent with our best intentions. It involves both the restraint of negative behavior and the cultivation of positive behavior. You went on to share 7 suggestions for more self-control. If our listeners haven't listened to these episodes, let me encourage you to do so. Again, it's episode number 3. Today, we're going to dive into the third of these leadership disciplines, self-care. As we begin, we want to encourage you to post your questions in the comments section of YouTube or wherever you happen to be watching. If you have a question and want to remain anonymous, you can text us at the number 615-721-2303. 615-721-2303. We won't use your name on the air if you text us that route. What do you wonder about when you think about self-care? What's hard about it? What are the sticking points when you think about self-care and Orthodox leadership? Deacon Michael will be answering these questions live in the second half of our show. All right, so Deacon Michael, I have to admit, I bristle a little bit when I hear the word self-care.
I know you do because when we first talked about doing this topic, you pushed back. And it was honestly so good for me because I've always kind of viewed it in the context, I think, of my faith. But I know
Mhm.
that there's a whole movement, there's a whole cultural movement that doesn't see self care as that. I mean, it's kind of self indulgence, but I'd like to hear from you. I'd like you to articulate for our viewers why does it make you bristle?
Yeah, yeah, I've wrestled with this a bit, and so here are the things that I think of, and I realize that well, I'll give it away a little bit, but the core of the concept is I'm wholly right there with you. I ingest it better if I just call it refueling time.
Yeah.
The time I need to pull over and fill my tank so that I can keep going. And here's why I think I've bristled. And I raise these because I think for our listeners are in ministry, many reasons, some of what I'm going to say may resonate or spark some reflection. So the first is that since I was a teenager, so now for about 3 decades, I've been trying to live life in response to Christ's call to love God and neighbor, taking seriously the kind of death to self that this call requires. Jesus' clear invitation to this: if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. I was probably 14 or 15 when I memorized Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. And I realized that this was joy, freedom, sustaining power. And this sustaining power includes the work to constantly ego check, constantly lose my life for Christ's sake, and paradoxically finding it. At the very same time, I we see in Jesus in the scriptures taking time alone to pray, having alone time, be still time, we actually call it at Crossroad. So refueling and recentering and quiet alone time is essential. But I think I've always had this question about the terminology of self-care. How can it make sense to care for the self that I'm trying to die to? So that was my first big question. The second sort of bristle comes from, I feel like a lot of the self-care conversation assumes that work and the rest of life should be wholly separated from one another. It comes out of sort of a business mindset that work is what you do to use your skills, make money, to support yourself, and it will necessarily deplete you, even suck the soul out of you. But my own research and ministry work has centered on this topic of vocation for Orthodox Christians. And the whole point of the vocation definition that we teach at Crossroad is that all of life is a response to God's call to love him and our neighbor. And so work is vocation. Home life is vocation. The way you rest and play is even vocation. All of life is lived in response to God's call. Almost daily, it is clear to me that my work evades the kind of split between when I'm working and when I'm not working. And I think that's true for a lot of us in full-time ministry. And I would imagine especially for clergy. I can I can finish my official work-bound time and have a connecting conversation with a dear friend, as I did yesterday. And that conversation is an extension of what I'm learning from work and what I can share because of work. Too often, what I hear about self-care, I feel like assumes a work and life fracture, when this fracture might be a part of the very problem. I think our call as Orthodox Christians is to integrate how everything we do can be sanctified. And that when we figure out the contours of that in our everyday life, no matter what we do, it has this powerful sustaining force. I have a sneaking feeling that this whole self-care movement can sometimes be trying to fix a problem that has a much deeper source. And there's definitely a lot of people who want to sell you a lot of things to help with your self-care. So the overarching second question I have is, does self-care, as it's often defined, include an unhelpful set of assumptions about the way we think about work? And then my third one is, how does our own story and cultural background and our own wiring shape our assumptions about self-care, or what I call refueling time? Are we treating the root of what we really need? I've always been sort of wired to take care of myself. My parents tell the story of when my brother was 5, I was 7, he fell and cut his lip on the corner of our coffee table. We had to go to the ER. It was in the evening. And so I just saw the scene and I thought, I gotta get ready for the night. And I went and got my warmest PJs on and other things to be prepared for a long wait in the waiting room. At the age of 7, I sort of looked ahead and said, okay, I need to take care of myself. In this instant, they're going to be taking care of my brother, so I'll figure it out. So I was just sort of wired that way. I grew up with a father who would also say, whenever life got too stressful, take the pressure valve off and help me opt out of doing that extra thing that would just drain me or make life stressful. And then as I got older, he's even said that for our whole family, my family. The extra busyness just wasn't worth the stress. My husband, I also have to say, is amazing at figuring out what I need to be sustained as a mom, wife, and director of a ministry team. And we both try to make decisions that care for the other's well-being. I share these thoughts because I have dear friends for whom taking care of themselves does not come naturally, and burnout is really real. And I think our own personal story and wiring is an important part of our determining our relationship with self-care. Related to this, I also want to say that I feel like there's sort of a dangerous American ethos, especially in high powered families, that you should always work more, achieve more, do more. And this is a huge problem itself. Research is now showing that anxiety and depression among teens is especially high in the schools that put pressure of the kids who are in schools that put pressure on achievement as an end.
Hmm.
Our third Crossroad director, Father Mike Tischel, would always exhort the teenagers that we're not supposed to be human doings, we're supposed to be human beings. And for so many of them in our culture today, it was this wake up moment um, when the pressure is, as you sort of leave high school and go into college, what are you going to do with your life? We shift the focus to who are you going to be? And who we are is directly related to who we say Christ is. And that changes everything. And teens say this to us. Crossroad is this moment where they taste a new freedom in who Christ is calling them to be, that is so different from the rat race of college and job preparation in the culture that surrounds them. It's a watershed moment. So, time and care given to figure out who you are is deeply important within this larger frame. So, my third sort of question around all this is, how does one's own story and cultural background and wiring shape our assumptions about self care or refueling time? And are we treating the root of what we really need? So, all of this is just to say, Deacon Michael, I know where you're going with this podcast and with some amazing recommendations for what you call self care, what I call refueling time, whatever we need to call it. And I will say, in my own best rhythms, I do them. When things are out of whack, I've left some off the list. So, resounding affirmation of what you're recommending. And for any of our listeners, if you're like me and you just the self care for whatever way you've been shaped, you bristle at the term, um, figure out the way you need to frame it so that it can give you what you need. One of my beloved teammates and Telos director, Jenny Haddad Mosher, had for a long time as her Facebook profile picture the quote, "Learn to rest, not to quit." And I think that's the essence
Good.
of it, especially for priests and others in full time ministry. How to rest well so that the fire stays lit and isn't deprived of oxygen out of sheer exhaustion. Your church and your people need the fire lit.
Amen. Well, I don't disagree with anything you've said. Now, having said that, I'm not quite sure I'm ready to give up on the term, but it definitely needs to be redefined. And I think we've got to rescue it from sort of the secular baggage and some of what's out there. So I want to kind of start, and if you'll permit me, with a definition of self-care, because I think that this will take it in a direction that is healthy for all of us. So here's how I define self-care. Self-care is the discipline of taking care of our spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical needs so that we have the resources we need to serve others well. Now, that's the key component of this, is that, we've got to have these resources so we can serve others well. So in a sense, it's a little bit like the flight attendant, when they come out and they say to you, in the unlikely event of a loss in cabin pressure, we want to encourage you to put on your own oxygen mask first before you try to help somebody else. Because if you pass out from lack of oxygen, you're not going to be much help to anybody else. So to put it another way, here's how I kind of find, sort of the middle way that's self-care. So on the one hand, we have self-care, and I see that as the middle way. And I love, by the way, what you said about calling and vocation, because I think that is a fundamental, sort of a foundational problem that we have in America, maybe throughout the world, but certainly as Orthodox Christians, we need to see it more holistically than that. And I think that one of the things that drew me to Orthodoxy when I converted 38 years ago or whatever it was Father Alexander Schmeman's book, For the Life of the World, where he talks, specifically, about this, no dichotomy between the secular and the sacred. It's one seamless whole. But you got self-care on the one hand, and then you've got self-indulgence. And I think that for Christians, for Orthodox Christians who kind of bristle at this word, I think that it's because they see the tendency for this to become kind of an end in itself, not as a stewardship, but as sort of an end in itself, kind of like pampering ourself. But the other extreme, I think, and this is where I often see this among some Orthodox clergy, not all, but I think people in the helping professions sometimes struggle with boundaries and
Mm.
sometimes struggle with burnout. And so they end up helping everybody else, at essentially at their own expense. So self-neglect is not the answer yet. And so I want to see sort of this middle way of what I'm calling self-care. So, at any rate, that's my definition.
So it sounds a lot like, from your definition, self care is really about stewardship. Does that sound right?
It is. And I would say that if there's one word that's kind of my key to understanding the world and to understanding all that God has called me to be, is that fundamentally I'm a steward. I'll give an account and I have stewardship over everything. And it's not just, my money, which is typically how we think of stewardship, but it's my time, my treasure, my talent, sort of that familiar framework that we've probably all used before, but it's true. And so I'm a steward over, my physical life, my spiritual life, all the rest of it too.
I love that. Again, let's encourage you to post your questions in the comment section of YouTube or wherever you happen to be watching. We'll get to those in the second half of the show. Okay, so what's at stake here, Deacon Michael, and why are you so committed to this discipline?
Well, I think there's a lot at stake. I think we have to again consider the fact that those in ministry are frankly in a very, very high risk category. I'm at the age where, I've been under the oversight of several priests now. I've been in a lot of other parishes, and I see a lot of people that are, especially in full time ministry, burning out
Mm.
and just serving other people. And the demands are so enormous. Like right now in our parish, we have so many visitors. We have I think 20 people as catechumens. We're growing like crazy. And that creates additional demands on the senior pastor. He's the only full-time uh, person that we have on the church staff. And it's a lot to manage. But I want to share some research that was done in a Protestant context among Protestant clergymen. And so this is sort of a summary that came together from, I don't know, about 10 different studies. I suspect, and you can challenge me on this if you want, but I suspect that the results or these statistics would be similar in an Orthodox context. So let me just give these to you. So first of all, 70% of those surveyed, and again, these are Protestant clergymen, report being extremely stressed or highly stressed, and 75%. That to me is astonishing. But it doesn't end there. 90% work between 55 and 75 hours per week. Now, in my book, Free to Focus, I talk about how crazy this is and why we call it the rule of 55, but after about 55 hours, your productivity actually goes backwards. 90% feel fatigued and worn out every week. And I would just ask those of you that are watching this, particularly those of you that are Orthodox clergy, does this ring true for you? You feel fatigued, worn out at the end of the week. 40% report a serious conflict with a parishioner at least once a month. And I mean, it depends upon your but I don't know too many people that thrive on conflict. That's an exhausting thing. This one, I don't know if this is true among Orthodox clergy, but this is scary all by itself. 80% will not be in ministry 10 years from now, and only a fraction will make it a lifelong career. If that's true, when you think of the investment the church has made in raising up qualified, skilled clergy, and if they don't remain, in the ministry for their entire career, that's a huge loss to the church. And we're already facing, enormous clergy shortage. 91% have experienced some form of burnout in ministry, and 18%, so almost 1 in 5, say they are fried to a crisp right now. So what do you think of those statistics? Do those ring true to you?
Some hit it right on the money. I have a hard time imagining people giving up on ministry 10 years from now, but it could be true.
I
But
don't,
but all of the rest, I mean, the stories that I'm hearing from folks it's been a hard season, and it's we're not structurally supported in the ways that would help us along.
Well, and I think, one of the things, if my parish is typical, there's been a lot of conflict during COVID. You have people that want everybody to be vaxxed, people that don't want it mandated, people who want to wear masks, people that don't want to wear masks. All that factors in, and people have deep feelings about this. I mean, part of it is I would just love to say, could we just relax and just let this go and let people do what they feel like they need? But it's more complicated than that, and I get that. So I thought it might be helpful to kind of think through the four broad categories that were in my definition to talk about what's at stake. So let me just kind of give that here. I think, first of all, there's definitely our spiritual life. If I don't take care of my spiritual life as a clergyman or as a lay leader, and I'm not here merely talking about my relationship to the church or my ministry to the faithful, but if I'm not careful, I risk dying spiritually and have nothing to give. And I would hate to do that. I think I may have mentioned this on a previous episode. I can't remember. But my first exposure, Anne, to Orthodoxy was when I was working in college at a 7-Eleven, and I used to have the local Orthodox priest would come in after hours to buy NyQuil because he was an alcoholic. And get this, he didn't believe in God. He was serving in a parish, and I don't know why I felt like he could confide in me, but I thought, wow, that's definitely one expression of the faith that I never would have considered. But of course, thank God I did. But I'm just saying that there was somebody that didn't give attention to his spiritual life, and I think it was very consequential. So, you remember the story of Mary and Martha in the book of Luke, chapter 10, where Martha's distracted with her serving. She approaches the Lord and says, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore, tell her to help me. And Jesus answered her and said, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part which shall not be taken away from her. So Jesus makes it clear that serving others, if we're not careful, can become a distraction to our cultivation of our own spiritual life. And it's, thankfully it's not either or, but we've got to make sure that we don't give it priority over our personal devotion. God didn't send his son into the world because he needed to recruit a bunch of workers, right? He sent his son into the world because first and foremost, he wanted to be in relationship with us. And in fact, that's what 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 9 says, that he's called us into fellowship with his son. And it's out of that relationship that everything else is going to flow in our ministry. So there's the spiritual life that we've got to consider. Then there's the mental life. So if I don't take care of my mental life, I risk distraction and frankly, distortion. And this is why we started this series with self-awareness. As my business coach once told me, some people think, most people think about what others think, and few think about their own thoughts. But we have to become increasingly aware of how our own thoughts are impacting ourselves and the way that we impact the world. And I think this is part of self-care, attending to our mental life. But then there's also the emotional life. So if I'm not careful, I risk blowing up or burning out. And both of these have enormous negative consequences if we don't have some kind of cadence to our life where we run and we rest. And, God's built this into the very fabric of creation with the idea of working 6 days and resting one day. But I can remember, and I'm not proud to admit this, but I can remember back when I was, I don't know, probably in my early 30s, and I was totally stressed out. I was trying to deal with all the challenges of, sorry, let me get my screen here. There we go. So I had to deal with all the challenges of trying to raise a big family. I've got 5 daughters, and that was challenging financially and in other ways. So Anne froze there, so I'm getting her back on the screen. There we go. So I can remember distinctly one point where it was just kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, where I just got angry and punched a hole in the sheetrock. And like I said, I'm not proud of that, but that was a result of not taking care of myself emotionally. And then finally, there's the physical part of life. And I think that this is part of it that we've got to pay attention to, because if, we risk becoming sick or incapacitated or even dying prematurely, and we can't serve others well if we're sick, right? Or if we're incapacitated in some way. And the way that I think of it, Anne, is there are two kinds of sickness: self-inflicted and non-self-inflicted, right? So the self-inflicted, we can't always avoid sickness in a fallen world. Sometimes we didn't do anything and we get sick. I don't think I did anything to catch COVID. I was really trying to be careful, to take care of myself, making sure I was getting adequate rest, all the things, but I got it. And so the main thing we've got to do is make sure that we don't suffer from the self-inflicted kinds of illnesses that so many people go through. So did I leave anything out?
No, those are so great.
Good. All right. Well, Go, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think perhaps, mind, soul, heart, and strength, you know, sounds pretty scriptural, number one.
Good. Yeah.
And also, I was just reflecting on this, the self-inflicted sickness, and how, how to figure out, first of all, I do think that it's rampant, but then how to figure out, um, if that's what you're suffering from or not, and if you have some good rubrics for that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I do. And I wanted to share just a little bit about some research that was done at the University of Pennsylvania, because I think it's kind of poignant. So let me do that. Then we'll get into the self-care practices.
Sounds great.
So this was Professor Alexandra Mickle, a former Goldman Sachs employee, conducted a 12-year survey of investment bankers. Now, I know clergy people have a lifestyle that's nothing like investment bankers, or is it? But these were people that regularly worked 100 to 120 hours a week. Now, the amazing thing about that is there's only 164 hours in a week. Sorry, 168 hours. So to work 20 hours means shortchanging everything else in your life: sleep, relationships, exercise, recreation, spiritual community activities, and basically everything. So to offset the loss, the banker's employer offered them round-the-clock administrative aid, meal and laundry services, and other domestic assistance. Now, as you can imagine, given their singular focus, the bankers were highly productive at the start. I mean, some of us wish we had that kind of help so that we could be really focused on the work that God's called us to be. So they came in with energy, with vigor, took advantage of the extra services that their employer provided, and worked hard and long, making huge strides, but it didn't last. And in fact, it couldn't last. So starting in year 4, bankers started to experience sometimes debilitating physical and psychological breakdowns. They suffered from chronic exhaustion, insomnia, back and body pain, autoimmune diseases, heart arrhythmias, addictions, and compulsions, such as eating disorders, causing them to exhibit diminished judgment and ethical sensitivity. I had a business coach one time that told me, he said, have you ever noticed that the more tired you are, the dumber everybody else gets?
Yeah.
And it's kind of true. I mean, the truth is, it has nothing to do with anybody else, but it has to do with your perception because you're exhausted. So Professor Mickle goes on to say, as their performance plummeted, they simply compensated for their diminishing output. How? By working longer, which caught them in a cycle of escalating work hours and chronic physical and emotional distress. So the idea is, like, I'm so far behind, I just got to put my nose to the grindstone and I'm just going to stay at it till I catch up. But of course, that doesn't happen, and it's a downward spiral. So I don't think I'm going to give that next bit of research that we had in the notes just for the sake of time, but I think that illustrates the point pretty well.
Powerful points. Powerful. I mean, just the inability to think clearly when you're working yourself to exhaustion.
I think it's easy to think, if we're not careful, and some of you watching may be thinking this, that you're the exception. And I can tell you that when I was young, and I'm 66, so back when I was in my 30s, I mean, I would have never admitted this if you had asked me, but I kind of acted as if I was immortal. It didn't matter what I ate. I could get by on 4 hours sleep a night. I didn't have to exercise because I was in good shape and I could handle it. But the truth is, it's like compound interest. It accumulates over time, and eventually, if you're not careful, you can have a breakdown. And I've, had a few health breakdowns, over the course of the years, and a lot of it was just self-inflicted. I just wasn't paying attention.
I think the hard part, I'm so glad the stats you did earlier were on ministry, because I think the hard part when you compare it to banking is, there's those bankers are clearly doing it for some monetary reward in the end. And so you can
Mm-hmm.
say just, it's more ego and money driven. And then when you flip it over to ministry, just the hours that a lot of clergy I know work the week just to respond to the needs of the faithful. And it's hard to put boundaries on that. And so that's, I feel like that's where the rubber really meets the road. And, for during COVID, I mean, the funerals that I'm one
Oh,
a dear friend who's a priest had 4 funerals in a week, um, regularly. So
well, it's incredibly demanding, and I didn't think about it till just now. But one of the best books that I've ever read, and every pastor, every Orthodox clergyman, everybody leading in the church should read it, and it's called Boundaries by the psychologist Dr. Henry Cloud. It was a book. It's been out for probably almost 20 years, but sold millions of copies. But it is a fantastic book. And I mean, the truth is, the only difference between a river and a swamp is a boundary.
hmm,
And if you want to end up really stagnant, like a swamp, don't have any boundaries. And I was talking to one of the priests at our church this morning, and he was talking about a crisis with a couple in our church, and I said, the things that we got to remember is that they didn't get in that crisis overnight. So when they call us and interrupt our dinner hour and want to talk in the middle of that, I mean, the truth is, again, I want to be compassionate, but my family's really important. If I blow up my family relationships in the service of the church, it's going to come back and bite me, in terms of my ministry. So they didn't get to those problems overnight. They're not going to solve it overnight. And, I can finish dinner with my family. So, at any rate.
that's that's wisdom right there. Folks listening, let us encourage you to post your questions in the comment section of YouTube or wherever you happen to be watching. We'll get to those in the second half of our show. Okay, let's get practical. What does self-care look like for leaders?
Okay. So I want to talk about 5 self-care practices. Now, I talk about these in chapter 3 of my book, Free to Focus. I'm not trying to plug the book, but some of you may want to read that because I go into more depth. I cover 7 practices in the book, but I'm only going to take the top 5 here in this session together. So self-care practice number 1 is sleep. So when it comes to making sure that you're at your best in order to serve others, nothing, Anne, is more important than sleep. It's the foundation for everything else, right?
Amen.
So it's a really important discipline. It's one that unfortunately a lot of leaders don't practice very well, and we think that we can just catch up on, someday during the week or whatever. But on average, Americans get just under 7 hours of sleep each night. And that number is already below the recommended 8. And it's probably overstated because people usually report the time they spend in bed, not the time they actually sleep. So we get about 20% less sleep than we think, according to researchers. But oftentimes we see sleep as kind of the enemy of productivity. But lack of sleep ultimately hurts our ministry. The Lancet, which is a medical journal, I know your husband's a doctor, so maybe he's familiar with this medical journal, but the Lancet reported, get this, they studied surgeons who stayed awake 24 hours, right? Why doctors do this, I don't know, but the doctors made more mistakes. Routine tasks took them longer, in fact, 14% longer, and those mistakes increased as the day wore on. Moral of that story is if you're going to get a surgery, get it early in the morning. But the impairment, and this was the thing that the Lancet said, the impairment was on a par with being intoxicated. And in another study that I quote in my book, people getting just 6 hours a night for 2 straight weeks function as if they're legally drunk. Wow. I mean, that's kind of astonishing. So, as adults, we've really got to think through our sleep. We've got to make it a priority. Sometimes, we may have to take a nap. By the way, interesting thing on naps. I've literally taken a 20-minute nap since I began my career every day. I found a way to do it. I'll cut the time off my lunch hour or whatever. And there's some famous nappers in the history of the world, including Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, John Kennedy, bunch of others. But let me just give you one tip on this that I think is important to sleep. And by the way, I know that especially for a lot of young parents, it's particularly difficult. And sometimes you have to swap out, with a spouse, or maybe swap out with another couple, just so you can get some decent sleep. But the tip I want to leave with people with regard to sleep is that managing when you go to bed is more important than managing when you get up. So set an alarm if you have to. I literally have on my iPhone an alarm that says time to start getting ready for bed, because I'm just like everybody else. I can drift into the late at night if I'm not careful.
That's so good. And I will say I'm a sleep fiend. That it is the most, there's no question for me, it's the most important. And also my husband, who is a physician, he has treated, he's a pediatric cardiologist and has treated patients who have trouble passing out, teenagers, who he literally just says, plug in your phone outside your room, don't bring it into your room, and make sure you actually protect that sleep area. And a month later, the passing out has stopped. And that actually what was going on with their heart actually had to do with lack of sleep because they were staying up all night on their phone.
Golly. Yeah, I know. I mean, I see it too in the teens and even in the young adults. Gail, my wife Gail, and I sponsor the young adults in our church. And so, we get to be with those people. And I know that it's really tempting. And I think it's, something that for single people too, they don't really have a reason or as much as a reason to get to bed. And so they might think, well, I'll just, stay up late, and that's easy to do. All right. So let's go to self-care practice number 2, which sounds obvious, but is eat. So one of the things I've learned over time is that the food that we eat makes an immediate, long-lasting, and powerful effect on our energy levels. And that's what's key. More important than time management is energy management. In fact, it's more important than time management. And so the conversation about what to eat or what not to eat, what constitutes a healthy diet, what's not a healthy diet, that could go in 100 different directions. It's well beyond the scope of our show tonight. But I want to share a few pieces of advice if you've never made a priority of healthy eating. And first of all, again, I would say it's like compound interest. It will catch up with you. First, I would say do your research. Most of us have never been educated on nutrition. I mean, I grew up in a home where, pretty much the standard was whatever tastes good. And we ate a lot of junk food and a lot of other things. And if you want to find a place to start, I would recommend a book like Blue Zones that's been around for a long time, heavily researched, or any book about the Mediterranean diet. Second point I'd make, eat natural. Foods such as vegetables, fruits, nuts, meats are better choices than practically anything you'll find in a package. And so my rule of thumb is if you can't pronounce the ingredients or it's loaded with sugar, you probably need to think twice. Then I would say be mindful of what you drink. I mean, I drink coffee, but what I don't do is like drink a pot of coffee. Because if you drink so-called energy drinks, soda, too much coffee, that starts actually, give you initial, boost, but then it trails off and it takes away more energy. So you end up in worse shape than when you started. And then finally, I would say, think about some supplements. It's very difficult to get all the nutrition that we need in the current American diet. So I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physician, I'm not a nutritionist, but I have learned from my doctors that I need to pay special attention, particularly for stress, to vitamin B12 and vitamin D. Those both play a huge role in helping me manage stress and feel more energetic. So my tip here is try to completely, and some of you are not going to want to do this, but I would encourage you to do this for 30 days and see what happens. Try it as an experiment. Cut out sugar and high glycemic carbs like pasta, like white bread, like things that turn to sugar quickly in the body, because those do have a detrimental impact on your health, long term and on your energy short term.
Hmm, that's great. Question for you. We have a robust culture of hospitality in the Orthodox Church. And so, for the clergy out there who do house blessings, who have a culture of meals, what do you recommend there?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I don't want to diminish this kind of practice of hospitality because I think it's one of the best aspects of Orthodox Christian life. But what I would say is I think that we may need to instruct people like before the house blessings, maybe from the pulpit, but to say, for example, say, hey, look, I really appreciate all your hospitality, but I'm going to be visiting a lot of houses. And if I eat these sweet desserts at every single house, I'm going to be more horizontal than vertical, and I don't want that to happen. So if I take a bite and decline to eat more than that, please don't be offended. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm taking care of my own health. So the thing I think we have to remember as leaders, people can't read our mind. And I think instructing people in that, because my guess is for those people, they get the priest one time a year and they're thinking, what could be the harm? What they don't realize is that you had 3 other blessings that day and you've got 120 left, and it's going to have an impact.
That's great. So helpful. Okay, what's the third practice?
Okay, third one is to move. Is to move. So too often we tell ourselves, and I've been guilty of this, we don't have enough energy to exercise. But exercise itself, and some of you are going to have to take this on faith, is an energizer. Exercise itself is an energizer. It gives more than it takes. In fact, few things have as direct an impact on our energy levels as a decent workout. If you get moving early, it'll pay huge dividends all day long. I can remember years ago, I was speaking at Beaver Creek, Colorado, and I was a little bit stressed out because I was actually speaking to about 30 speech coaches. So people that would evaluate speakers and give them guidance in their speaking. And so, I was stressed out because I thought, 30 people are going to be judging me and evaluating me and all that stuff. And so I got up that morning, I called Gail and I said, man, I'm like stressed out. I'm anxious about this. She said, have you gone for a run today? Because that was my practice back then. I walk now, but I was running at the time. And I said, no, I haven't. She said, I'll tell you what, I want you to stop what you're doing. I want you to go run for 30 minutes and then call me back. And I did. Guess what? Totally shifted my mood. I was no longer anxious. I was energized. I was excited about speaking, and everything kind of turned around. But according to the CDC, quote, only a few lifestyle choices have as large an impact on your health as physical activity. So a regular exercise routine has been tied to weight control, lower stress, vitality, increased energy, reduced risk of heart disease and cancer, overall improved quality and length of life. Plus, you can achieve these benefits without spending hours a day in the gym. Who has time for that, right? But the CDC says, and again, I'm quoting from their website, you could put yourself at lower risk of dying early by doing at least 150 minutes of a week of moderate intensity aerobic activity. And that's just 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. Now, ideally, of course, you'd be doing some strength training. It's important for weight loss and for maintaining strength and balance and flexibility. But, my own plan is I work out 50 minutes a day. And by the way, I get double duty off of this because I also listen to podcasts or listen to books. So it's a great way to nourish my mind, to, increase my education and my learning. So exercise doesn't just strengthen your body, it also strengthens your mind. And so my tip is take on some sort of challenge with regard to your exercise. 10,000 steps a day. We've got this going on at our company right now. We've got a step challenge going on. 30 minutes a day, whatever it takes, but challenge yourself as an experiment and then just notice how different you feel.
Hmm. I remember, I think you quoted this at some point, but I remember hearing, the setting yourself up for success too in exercise. So uh, I notice, so I'm an after dinner walker or runner. Um, I will be more likely to do that walk or run after dinner if I put my sneakers on before dinner.
Yes.
Just teeny little things make a huge difference.
One of the things that some of my work professionally is around goal achievement, but one of the things that we've learned is what the goal achievement researchers call an activation trigger, and that is something that makes it easier, like what you've done there. Like you could put out your sneakers the night before, so the next morning you're all set to go running, or do it before dinner. But it just puts you in a much better position, and you're more likely to follow through if you have an activation trigger like that.
Awesome. Okay, so what's the fourth practice?
Okay, the fourth one. I love this one. Connect. We need connection. But I want to start at a place that we don't typically think of, and that is connecting with God. It's the single most important thing we can do if we want to serve others well. So one of my favorite passages of scripture is John 15, verses 4 and 5. Jesus makes this clear. He says, "Abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing." So there's also this passage I love in Mark chapter 3 and verse 13 through 15, where Jesus chose the 12 primarily so that they could be with him, right? So it wasn't so that they could do work for him, or so they could, get the message out, any of that stuff, any ministry stuff. And this is why I've said before, self-leadership precedes any other kind of, group leadership. And that starts in our relationship with God. And Jesus himself felt the need. I mean, here, the Son of God, very God of very God, felt the need to periodically depart to a lonely place and pray. So critically important. And then, of course, connecting with family and friends is important too. And God made us to live together in community. And we just can't be, production machines. I like how you said it earlier. And I actually said this in another book I wrote too. God made us human beings, not human doings. But sometimes, for those of you that are Orthodox clergy, a night out with friends, a getaway with your family, a cup of coffee with, a colleague, a fellow pastor, or somebody in your church is a great way, pays huge dividends in terms of our energy and our emotional well-being. And so one of the things I would say as a tip, particularly on the creating with God part of this, is to create for yourself a morning ritual, certain things that set you up so that you're a good steward of what God has given you and set you up so that you can serve others well, whether that's prayer, reading the scriptures, journaling, whatever it is that puts you in that place where you feel connected to God so that you can be a pipe through which, the Holy Spirit can flow and minister to others.
So good. Thank you.
Okay, the last one.
Let's do it.
All right, we're almost there. Then we're going to take some questions. Okay, self-care practice number 5, unplug. So the writer Anne Lamott says it this way: almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. So we've got to be purposeful about time off. Don't blow that off. That's so important. And in my experience, people in the helping professions, especially pastors, are terrible at this. They don't seem to have boundaries and they end up not unplugging. So I think of it this way. There's 3 kinds of time. There's front stage, that for people that are professional clergy, people that are in full-time ministry. Front stage might be serving at the altar, preaching, teaching, counseling, leading meetings, etc. That's front stage time. Then there's backstage time, preparing for those front stage activities, including studying, handling email, administrative tasks, all the stuff that goes, with parish life that's not front stage. And there's a lot of people that aren't even aware that there is this category, and that's off stage, time away from your normal responsibilities. So I can think back when Gail had to have a very serious conversation with me about 20 years ago, when I had got a promotion at work, I'd made a big bonus, and I came home and she tried to smile and be enthusiastic, and she set me down in the den and she said, "Babe, I love you and I appreciate so much everything you do for our family." And she began to tear up a little bit. And she said, "But I got to be honest with you." She said, "You're never here. You're never at home." And she said, "Even when you are, you're not fully present." And she said, your 5 daughters need you now more than ever. And then she began to cry and she said, honestly, I feel like a single mom. Well, Anne, that was, a wake-up call for me because I realized that I had put at risk my family, something that I prize dearly, because I couldn't turn it off and I couldn't unplug. So that unplugging is really important. And so my tip here would be just create an ideal week. In other words, if you had 100% control of your time, and I realize that most of us don't. I own my own company. I don't have 100% control of my own time. But an ideal week, if you had 100% control of your time, how would you like to spend it? And literally commit to time off. That's got to be part of that ideal week. Time off when you're going to be off stage and when you're going to give attention to the things that we're talking about here. Why? Not so you can be self-indulgent, but so that you can be a better steward of what God's given you so that you can better serve and fulfill the calling that you've been given. So that's it. That's the 5.
So good. So good. Okay. So we want to get to our listeners' questions. Please, if you have some that you are been dying to share, there's also, we have but don't want to out yourself and your name publicly, something hard that you want to ask, please know that you can text them. And Deacon Michael, we have a bunch in the chat, so I would love to share those. I think the first one that comes is sort of a paragraph here, but I would name from Mary Catherine Stanessa. Hello, Mary Catherine. I love this one. Self-care within the ministry of the church. The priest should not be expected to do it all on his own. Say a little bit more about that and how the parish, the congregation, can support and help the priest in self-care. How can those of us who love our priests help them protect themselves?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And for Mary Catherine, kudos to you for asking such a great question. But I would say this. I would say, first of all, and we're going to talk about this next week in the leadership strategy of Jesus, because that's going to be the topic for next week. But I think that there's this model that's not biblical, it's not patristic, it's not Orthodox, and it simply doesn't work. But that's the idea, where the priest is in full-time ministry and he's active and the rest of us are passive. And the work of the ministry is 100% his responsibility. And one of the things we'll see next week, but in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 12, St. Paul says that he's given pastors and teachers in order to equip the saints. And by saints, he means not the canonized saints, but the rank and file members of the church have been given the responsibility for the ministry. The pastor's job is to equip the saints, us, everybody else, for the work of ministry. So it's got to be a group effort. I would say that'd be number one. Number two is, I think, if you're not the pastor and you're in the congregation, if you're among the faithful, then I think you've got to realize that there are limits to your pastor's life. Be aware of that. Thank them when they go out of the way to serve you. Realize that they've got a lot of demands on their time. Be forgiving if they're tired and they snap or they say something that may be a little bit unkind. But yeah, I just think that we've got to take more responsibility off them. And if you're on the parish council, please, if you're in a position where the bishop would allow it, fund additional staff. To the extent that you can, to expect one person to do as much as most pastors do is ridiculous. It is just not right.
Here's another good question from Lucas Alexander. Hello, Deacon Michael and Ann. What would you recommend for a person after they suffer a crisis to get back into the discipline of self-care? Great question.
Yeah, I think in everything, there's a gift, right? So in other words, even in a crisis, there can be an enormous gift because it may, if it's severe enough, remind us of our own mortality. It may remind us that things are out of whack, and particularly if it's something that was self-inflicted, that something's got to change. So I think we've got to be careful that we don't sort of react like somebody that goes on a 3-day drunk and then all of a sudden decides they're going to be sober And now all of a sudden they get crazy and start preaching to everybody, about it. I think what we've got to do is we've got to take baby steps and ask ourselves, what would be the few things that I could do that would have the greatest impact in terms of self-care? And of those 5 practices, they're in the order they're in for a reason, but I would say sleep. Sleep cures a lot of problems. A lot of the reasons we get sick, a lot of the reasons our immune system goes down is because we're not getting adequate rest. So maybe that's where it needs to start. But I would start small, start baby steps. Don't get too crazy, because that just doesn't work to try to take on too much at once.
Mm. I love just the vision of that, realizing that sleep is self-care, and getting back, that sleep in response to crisis, is
Yeah,
okay. That's important.
definitely.
Yeah. Here's a big, lofty question coming from Ancient Faith Ministries. Are we willing to admit that we are actually not immortal?
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of those things where I think when we consider it at a theoretical level, we understand it.
Yeah.
But at a practical level, we act like we're going to live forever.
Yeah.
Or we think, and this frankly is nothing but pride, and that is we think we're the exception. Look, I know everybody else needs 8 hours of sleep, but I can get by on 4. Or, I know that uh, other people need to exercise, and I intend to get to it, but not yet, right? So I think that we got to be careful about that.
Yeah. Another question. Do you have a morning ritual? And would you share it?
I do. I just retooled it. So let me tell you what it used to be, and then I'm going to tell you how it changed, because I think how it used to be is more normal for most people. So, and I've done this literally for decades. So first thing I get up in the morning, first thing I do is I pray. I say my morning prayers. So for me, that takes anywhere from 25 to 30 minutes. And by the way, let me just say, if you're a single parent, or if you're a young parent, or depending on your season of life, don't measure your season by my season. I'm an empty nester. I own my own company. I've got a lot of discretion over my time. So I don't want this to be, and I'm sometimes reticent to share this because I don't want it to be a burden to anybody. So, but I pray. Then I read the scriptures. And so for years, I've read through the 1 year Bible, which gives me exposure to the entirety of the scripture. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the Apocrypha, but I read the entirety of the scripture over the course of a year. Then I journal. And so that's about a 15-minute practice. Gail got me into that about 10 years ago. And I said to her, I rolled my eyes and I said, I am not a journaler. And she said, and she used my own stuff on me, which sometimes ticks me off. But she said, just try it for 30 days. Just try it as an experiment. And if you don't like it, you can give up on it. Well, I didn't give up on it. I loved it. It helps me process what's going on in my life and be more reflective, be more thoughtful about what's happening and what it might mean. Then I exercise, and like I said earlier, for 15 minutes, and then, shower and get ready for work. Now, how I changed it, Anne, and this is kind of interesting, I think, is I realized that I'm at my very best for creative work first thing in the morning.
Hmm.
And so prayer, Bible reading, journaling, exercise, those are all important. But honestly, they don't take much creativity, right?
Hmm.
So what I'm doing now is, and I'm literally just a week and a half into this, is I get up and pray first thing, because I feel like I got to pray first thing, give that, those first few moments to God. Then I work on some project, some creative thing that I'm working on for another couple hours. And then at the end of the day is when I will stop, read the Bible, journal, exercise, do all those things that I used to do first thing in the morning. So far, it's working great.
Sounds wonderful.
Well, I think you got to kind of be aware. I don't think for anybody, just kind of be aware of how your energy ebbs and flows during the day, and ask
Hmm.
yourself, what should I be doing now given, my energy level?
Hmm. That's great. Well, you have given us a rich piece to think about, self care as not self indulgence and not self neglect. It's this middle way where we are really taking care of our spiritual life, our mental life, our emotional life, and our physical life. And you gave us 5 clear practices that we can really drill down on in this regard. There are 7 in your book, but for now, we went through sleep, eat, move, connect, and unplug. Lots for us to think about, Deacon Michael. We are so, so grateful.
Thank
Okay, that's all the time we have for this episode. We so appreciate you joining us tonight. We'll be back here again, God willing, next week at that time. We plan to discuss the leadership strategy of Jesus. Deacon Michael, as we wrap up, any final thoughts about self-care?
No, I would just say that, self-care is one of those things that we need to give attention to. And I think that we need to build a cadence where this is just something that we do routinely. But again, I would just think of it as stewardship, the way of us taking care of ourselves so that we can serve other people better.
Amen. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks, Ann.